Welcome to Haggy Reads for You on Wolf Spirit Radio. Colleen, her Haggy, reads children's stories for the wee ones up to the teens. She also reads books for grown-ups. Tune in, kick back, relax, and listen in. You're listening to Wolf Spirit Radio.
Hi everyone, it's Colleen, otherwise known as Haggy at Haggy Shack Radio and Wolf Spirit Radio, and it is September 7th, 2015, Wednesday, and I am picking up this week where I left off last week with Nancy L. Hopkins' book, The 9/11 Crusade. So I know you all weren't wanting me to stop where I left last week, but I told you I'd be back, and here I am. And look at this, Sarah pointed at the wheel. How the hell was that tire melted like that? Sid studied the image. The right side and top of the wheel was still there, but the left side and bottom were completely gone. As he looked closer, he decided the stuff that seemed to be flowing away from the tire might be what was left of a partially melted tire. He looked away from the computer screen and at Sarah. She brought up the second screen. Here's another fire truck. Well, actually, I found out it was a hazmat truck. Sid turned back to the screen. This was an easily identifiable vehicle. The bottom portion was red and appeared to have little damage, and the tires were intact. But the top white half of the truck had incurred a massive and very strange attack. While the back of the top was still white, with seemingly perfect paint, the rest of it looked like someone had taken a huge blowtorch to it. There was no paint, and the metal looked like it had gone through different stages of melting. The middle of it was not only missing, it looked like it had melted and then solidified. A glob of metal was hanging at the bottom of the hole, and the hole was probably a quarter of the entire top. The engine compartment was visible, and so was the fact that the engine was missing. Very quietly, Sid asked, "What could possibly do that?" Another fire truck photo appeared. This time it looked like some huge piece of debris had fallen on the cab and engine, leaving the rest of the truck intact. Problem was, there was no debris in the picture. It looked like the cab and engine block had wilted down to half their sizes. Sarah again moved to change the photo while saying, "Those were in Ground Zero. This series shows cars along FDR." Sid could not believe what he was seeing. A half-mile away from destruction at Ground Zero was a line of parked cars under an overpass along FDR Drive. At least 4 of the cars looked like they had melted. Sarah pointed to the middle section of the image and silently clicked to a new photo. This is a close-up of that section. There were 2 melted and twisted gray carcasses. What was the front end of one car was under either the back or the front of the car that had been parked in front of it. Neither car had any tires. Sid asked, "How the hell did they get 'em stacked like that?" "I don't know. Maybe they were moved after the fact. But that's not the point. The point is, they're all completely melted a half-mile from the trade center." Sarah brought up another picture. This time it was a police cruiser and appeared to also be under the overpass. "Look at this cruiser. The top half has tremendous heat damage. Again, the engine compartment looks shriveled and melted, and the damage appears to consume the interior. But look at the back door. How could a raging fire completely destroy the paint on the top part of the door, while leaving the bottom part looking perfect except for a sooty look to it. And look at the rear. It looks perfect. Does all that look right to you? Sid just shook his head. No. Again, Sarah changed the image. Now, this is of a parking lot, but I'm not sure where it was. 7 cars were parked in a row, with 4 other cars visible in a row toward the foreground. All the cars were burnt except one convertible at the edge of the photo that appeared unmarked by fire, including the cloth roof. Sid was studying the photograph and noted, "These 2 cars in the back row, where are their engines?" He pointed to a car at the far left and the far right. The 4 automobiles between them were similarly destroyed, but still had the engine hoods. The 2 cars Sid pointed out just had holes where the engines and hoods should be. Here's another photo of cars on a street. You see 5 cars and the bus burned. Do you see any obvious debris that should have started fires? No. But notice that all the door handles are missing, like they just disappeared, leaving holes where they had been. And windows were missing. If there was enough force from the collapse to blow out windows of vehicles, how is it that there were few reports of blast damage to humans? I have a few more of these kinds of car pictures, but this is another really strange thing. Sarah was searching through the files. Ah, here it is. I was looking for damaged cars and found this. This is an overhead shot of the parking lot in the northwest corner of the trade center. I noticed cars in this section all had a reddish-orange look to them, while the rest of the cars just looked normal and undamaged. So I figured the orange-brown cars were the ones burned. This picture was taken by an airborne camera from NOAA and dated 9/23/2001. Now that is only 12 days after the fact. The reason I'm pointing it out is because I could confirm the date. The reason the date is important is because I believe the orange color is coming from rust. Sarah made another image change. This time, there were 4 photographs. The top 2 showed a section of a parking lot with rows of cars. Some of the cars appeared to be without damage or partially damaged. In the middle of these were a partial row of cars completely covered in rust. The bottom 2 photographs were of a flatbed truck hauling 4 crushed, bright orange, completely rusted cars. I come across these photos and noticed the rust, but I had no date. Yet I first saw them only a few months after the attack. I wondered why they had rusted so fast. But with the orange look to the cars in the Noah photograph that I could date to less than 2 weeks after the attacks, I really started wondering about the rust. Here's another rusted vehicle. It was a Pepsi-Cola truck that had the similar attack against the engine section, with the rest of the truck untouched. It was showing the front of the truck. The very front of the grill area, top of the hood and bumper were rusted badly. 2 men in military camouflage uniforms were leaning up against the truck. Again, I don't have a date, but the fact these apparent soldiers are in it suggests that this was early in the game. It's another indication of accelerated rusting. Another photo was now showing a pile of rubble, obviously directly at ground zero, as a piece of facade from one of the towers was visible in the background. Whatever comprised the pile of rubble was all orange, like rust-colored. This photograph came from FEMA and is dated October 13th. Sid, does anything rust that fast in a month? I've never seen it. Sid was focused on the strange orange smoke in the middle of the photograph. Sarah, Nellie said there were fires that burned for 3 months. She thought it was an indication that micro-nukes were used in the basement. But that, he pointed to the photograph, does not really look like typical smoke. Is it rust suspended in smoke, or is it rust dust being kicked up? Oh man, that's what I call fuming. And this really freaks me out. You see how that stuff doesn't look like it's being blown around, but rather how it's just up like it's emanating from the debris pile? Yeah, I know what you mean. It doesn't look natural for some reason. And you say it's not smoke. I agree with you. It's weird. Here's a photo from Time magazine, supposedly taken on October 31st. The photo showed 6 workers on top of the debris that was fuming. There were 2 steam shovels on either side of them. Sid, if there was that much smoke, how could the workers be breathing without respirators on? If it was steam, why are they able to work in that heat? Another mouse click, and Sarah said, here's an aerial view of the entire area. This is what it looked like for days after the event. Have you ever seen the site of a demolition with clouds of smoke like stuff just engulfing the site? This just doesn't look right. Sid was studying the photograph. The whole of lower Manhattan, surrounded by water, was visible. Everything was clear except the World Trade Center area, where this peculiar thick haze was just hanging. Do you know what the official explanation is? He asked. Well, there was an article in New Scientist written in December claiming the still burning fires had been allowed to burn because they were not threatening anything and they were still trying to find bodies. That was the reason given for not flooding the area with water. They claimed the fires were fueled by office furniture and equipment, hydraulic fluid from miles of elevator hydraulic systems, cars from the underground parking lots, and plastics. But what's confusing is where all the metal file cabinets went. Someone estimated that there were 45,000 filing cabinets in the 2 towers. Yet only this was found, and the image changed. Sid was stunned. He was looking at a hunk of metal about the size of a basketball. How would anyone know this piece of burned and melted gunk is a filing cabinet? Sarah pointed at the red and blue in the photo. Because of these, Sid, those are pieces of files embedded right in what is left of the metal. You're telling me that the only filing cabinet out of an estimated 45,000 ended up looking like this, but shards of paper files inside the cabinet are still there. And I don't believe this. Well, it gets even stranger. One official I saw at a press conference said that plastic identification cards survived over all other things. Now, how the hell do plastic and paper survive when metal burns and melts? Don't have a clue. We only demolished empty buildings. Maybe the stuff we used is a clue. Jimmy called it nanothermite. What is it? Well, thermite's been around since the late 1800s. It's a combination of aluminum and rust powder. The nano part has to do with making it very small and uniform at the molecular level. And that technology makes it rather secret. I've never heard of it before. Sarah asked, rust powder? I'm not sure it would be the source of rusting you're talking about. Thermite creates intense heat. It can take iron to 2,500 degrees. But you can use additives to create a massive explosion. We used it as a cutter explosive to break the huge main steel girders in pieces small enough to be hauled away and to virtually pulverize the concrete. We just took these plastic containers full of it and placed them where they would do the job. And the containers were specialized to keep any explosive sniffing dogs from detecting it. Sid, Is there any way thermite could disintegrate a column of metal? I'm not sure what you're asking. Sarah was already looking for the file. Ah, here we go, she said as the photograph came into view. It was a series of 4 photographs, taken from exactly the same position. It was probably taken from a roof or upper floor, looking at a water tower used as an air conditioning cooling tower on the adjacent building's roof. Behind the water tower and to the right was an intact building. To the left of that building was an image of what looked to be remains of the outside facade of one of the towers and a few stories worth of metal structures. Also to the left was a cloud of smoke or debris. In the second photo in the series, the metal facade and associated structures had started leaning toward the left, as if it was all about to fall into the debris cloud below. In the third photo, the structure stopped tilting and just started falling apart. In the fourth photo, the dust that remained just blew away. Oh my, Sid said. No, nothing we did would cause metal to disintegrate like that. Sid kept looking at the progression of views, and finally he asked, Sarah, what do you think happened? Sarah did not reply. She brought up another image. It was another aerial shot showing the entire World Trade Center complex. Sid, this was what it looked like right after. Does the debris field look like it's big enough? Sid was studying the photograph. There was no way near enough debris. Sarah, where did the buildings go? His mind was racing, trying to find an explanation as to why there was no apparent mound of debris. Even if it had collapsed into the substructure, that would only be 7 stories high. The towers had been 110 stories tall. That thermite is amazing, Sid exclaimed. How the hell did they explain away the lack of debris with the pancaking collapse that Marty says they claimed happened? Sid did not expect an answer. He was just thinking out loud. So, Sid, you think the nanothermite could have been able to completely pulverize those towers into dust? Sid was thinking, maybe. I'm just not sure. With conventional explosives, the debris pile is way too low. But I'm just not familiar with what nanothermite is capable of doing. But you don't think it could lead to metal turning into dust or rusting so fast? Not really. And it certainly would not have melted cars a half a mile away. Sarah, what do you think caused those things? Let me show you. Sarah was interrupted from pulling up another photo when Sid put his hand over her hand on the mouse. Sarah, what do you think caused this? Sarah abruptly got up like she had some purposeful thing to do. She turned around saying, Sid, for the first time in what seems forever, I'm telling you things I've discovered and you're listening to me. You're not looking at me like I'm some kind of nut job. It just feels so good to be with you and sharing this, and Sid interrupted. Sarah, what I've gone through in the last 24 hours has led me to a place where I could believe anything, including a death ray having been used. Sarah started only to be interrupted again. Wow, you really think it's a death ray? Now, Sid, even I couldn't imagine it. Just listen. I took the same photo collection and talked to Tom McNally. You remember him. He teaches with me at the university. He's a number of science degrees. Sarah sat back down and again moved the mouse. The first photo I showed him was of the hazmat truck, and that looked of melted metal. The photo Sarah opened had the hazmat truck on one side, and next to it was a tin soda can. The can had a hole in it, and around the hole were scorch-like marks, and the can was bent at the hole as if it had been only partially melted. It looked just like the damaged section of the hazmat truck. Tom took one look at the damage and said, "That looks similar to the Hutchison effect." To make a long story short, Tom pulled out some printed literature about John Hutchison, and we got more data off the internet. Who's this Hutchison? He's a Canadian scientist-inventor who experimented with concepts put forth by Nikola Tesla. You know Tesla? No, not really. I heard the name, but don't really know much about him. Tesla was contemporary to Edison. In fact, Tesla worked for Edison after immigrating to the U.S. from Serbia. The two scientists became bitter enemies over the concept of electricity. Edison put a fortune into developing an electrical system based upon direct current. Tesla developed another system called alternating current, which is what we use now. Edison fought Tesla's concept, and Tesla simply took it to Westinghouse, who had Tesla build it at Niagara Falls. They made millions, and Tesla became very famous and rich. At that point, he developed all sorts of concepts used today, like radio, remote control, radar, free energy, and even robotics. Tesla may have been our greatest scientist. He also claimed to have developed a directed energy weapon, or what we call a death ray. When was this? Sid asked. Oh, I'm not sure. Sometime before World War II. Surprising. I'd have thought something like that would be relatively new. What happened with it? Well, Tesla wrote about it but never demonstrated it publicly, and for practical purposes nothing ever come of it that I know of. However, Hutchison apparently did demonstrate peculiar effects when experimenting with Tesla's concepts. Now, Sid, there are those who claim Hutchison is a fraud, but there are also many who think he's really on to something incredible. Relax, Sarah. I accept we've entered the twilight zone, Sid said with a smile. Okay. The thing that Tom McNulty thought was the most awesome effect was that of levitating heavy objects. Hutchison would fire beams of energy at different objects. Sarah stopped. Do you want to take time to look him up on the internet? Sid looked at his watch and replied, For now, just give me the overview. Okay. Tom put his students to task. He had them research Hutchison, and they found video documentation of his experiments. Hutchison had been included in a few documentaries. You can actually see him levitating a 70-pound cannonball and 6 inches in the air using only 400 watts of power. Many of the videos show pieces of metal vibrating until they just take off. Then the camera angle shifts and you see them stuck to the ceiling. Sid noted, 400 watts. That would be what it would take to power a few light bulbs. Right. Well, as soon as Tom made the connection to Hutchison effect, he asked me if I'd seen any instances of levitation. He was laughing when he said it, but he stopped laughing when I asked him if cars flipped over on their roofs or ending up on a wooden fence would fit the bill. You actually found cars on top of wooden fences and flipped over? Sarah pulled up a collage of photographs. Sure enough, flipped over cars and one balanced on a wooden fence, although the weight was being maintained by surrounding structures. One photo had 2 cars in a row, as if parallel parked, and one was on its roof. Sid said nothing. Sarah continued. In the original report that Tom had, it said Hutchison would hit things with energy beams, and he'd have one or two effects. Sometimes the object would flip over, and sometimes they'd simply be destroyed. Tom's students started searching every photo they could find of 9/11. They did not find photos with mini-flip cars, but when they did, they were in a group of other cars that looked melted. Sid asked, "So the effect of whatever this energy was, it either destroyed things or produced some sort of anti-gravitational effect, correct?" "Exactly." "Interesting." Well, Tom had an idea, an aha moment, and made a connection between the concept of levitation and the strange expansion of the towers at the moment of destruction. If you recall, both towers just erupted into massive debris fields. The size of the debris fields were many times the size of towers. Tom wondered if this expansion was similar to what happens when water turns to steam. Sarah continued, "He said a steam field is 1,600 times as great as the volume of water. Tom started calling this molecular dissociation, where the molecules are repelling instead of attracting. In the case of steam, heat causes dissociation. During 9/11, cars flipped because their molecules began repelling the ground underneath. And I honestly don't understand the full implications, but Tom said this all has to do with the Casimir force, which is something in quantum physics." Sarah caught her breath before continuing. "So we kept looking for things Hutchison found and came across a discussion of strange melting effects on metal. Supposedly, Hutchison had hundreds of metal samples having holes, twists, peeling, flaking, splits, thinning, and eruptions. I wouldn't take the time to pull up those photos, but I can tell you there's a vast number of 9/11 photographs showing various metals in very strange conditions, like the filing cabinet photo, although that one was maybe on the extreme side." "Like what?" "Like huge beams that were twisted and folded, not bent and crushed. And the damage to the vehicles that I showed you, and pressurized air and oxygen tanks that firemen wear. Numerous testimonies mention these tanks begin failing and depressurizing and sometimes exploding, like the metal in the tanks was failing." Sid commented, "What you're describing sounds like it would take a massive amount of energy." "As I understand it, remembering I'm not a scientist, it takes a relatively small amount of energy. What happens is that there's an exciting of the natural frequency of the structure." Tom explained it similar to harmonics. If you hit the middle C on a piano, all the other C notes begin a slight vibration. All you have to do is get one sequence of molecules excited, and the rest begin a harmonic vibration. So, what you're saying is that energy was added at the atomic level, which started a vibration that disrupted the molecular cohesion of everything that made up the towers. Exactly. The energy holding together molecules of, let's say, aluminum, was disrupted, and the molecules came apart. And apparently once this domino effect starts, it's difficult to stop, as demonstrated by the rapid rusting. Tom used the phrase, "not self-quenching." So I asked him, if this reaction doesn't naturally stop what would be used to try to stop it. He thought for a moment before saying, maybe dirt. Huge amounts of dirt were poured over the remains of the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown in Russia. So Tom's students started looking at dirt. And don't you know, they found lines of dump trucks bringing dirt into ground zero. Really? Trucking in dirt? Right. Trucking in dirt until the entire area had dirt all over the place. And then they started taking out dirt, just as was done in Chernobyl. So what do you think's happening? Will they or have they stopped the process? All I know is that 2 months ago I visited Nell and went down there. The fuming was still going on and trucks were still moving around dirt. In one area, I watched them picking up pieces of rubble and putting it in a truck that was then covered with dirt. For all I know, they'll never stop it. Wouldn't it be ironic if, in the end, Ground Zero, New York, turns out to be more polluted than Hiroshima was? And the fuming, you think, is what? We think it's an indication the process is continuing to break stuff down into basically dust or rust. Sarah and Sid sat for many moments, silently thinking. Finally, Sarah said, "You know, whatever they did affected human beings, too. Sid, there were 2,752 people unaccounted for. Only 200 complete bodies were recovered. If the destruction was simply due to pancaking floors, wouldn't there be a lot more actual bodies found? In a couple of testimonies, people said that they saw other people just disappear right in front of them." "What?" "Like one fireman was running inside the lobby floor because the second tower was rumbling, and the people running in front of him just disappeared." "Damn, that's spooky." From directly above the small house, Jimmy said, "Damn straight it's spooky." The helicopter was absolutely silent except a swooshing sound from the motors. He had been monitoring the conversation inside Crystal's house between Sid and Sarah. Jimmy was stunned at how much data Sarah had collected. Of course, she had not done it alone. Now there was the McNally and group of unidentified students in the mix. And how many of these people had talked to others, Jimmy wondered. The situation was well out of control. "No way to put a cap on this," Jimmy said aloud. Bob Shreves replied, "No, I guess not." Stevens was flying the small stealth chopper. "Sir, we gotta get fuel now." "All right, never a good time to leave," Jimmy mumbled. If anyone could see the helicopter right now, it would be black. By the time they landed at the closest airport, it would look like a typical civilian chopper painted dark red. This was no longer the most advanced stealth helicopter, but no one else had anything like it operational. Unfortunately, it still needed aviation fuel. For the next 45 or so minutes, Jimmy would be out of the loop. He keyed the radio. The signal was weak and breaking up, but Jimmy hoped Roger could hear him. Roger Gardner heard enough to know his boss was going for fuel. After that, he lost the signal. Roger snickered while thinking, "For all the electronic gadgets we have, it still comes down to an antenna system." Roger was hoping James Morris would get back before any decision-making would be required. Sarah was answering her cell phone. As soon as she said hello, Crystal replied, "Sarah, Nellie and her friend have been taken. George said he saw someone pick 'em up. I've gone over to their room and then the pool, and finally I asked George if he'd seen them. They've been gone for 20 minutes or so." "Who picked them up?" Sarah had fear in her voice. "Someone in a black SUV. I'll call Nell." Her hand was shaking as she looked at the phone like she'd never seen it before. Fear was paralyzing her mind. Sid also had fear in his voice while asking, "What?" "Someone took the kids." She finally focused enough to dial Nellie's cell phone. It kept ringing, and Sarah was afraid the answering service would momentarily reply with Nellie's voice directing Sarah to leave a message. "Hi," said the male voice. Roger Gardner had answered Nellie's phone. "Who's this?" Sarah demanded. She continued without waiting for an answer. "Where's Nell?" "Right here." But you're not going to talk to her. We're all enjoying your little cabin. Why don't you join us? Then the phone went dead. Son of a bitch, Sarah mumbled, before telling Sid what had happened. Sid was looking around to see if he had anything lying about. Take me back to the motel. They had both started out the door before Sarah realized. Duke! No time, just leave him here. Right. What are we going to do? I need to pick some things up, and then I'm going to drive over, park at the bottom, and go up the back way. Sarah mentally followed the route Sid described. What about me? You stay with Crystal. Sarah cursed before saying, This is my child you are about to rescue. Have you got a gun? You know, I can handle a gun. Sid realized that Sarah was right. His mind wanted to think like a 20-year-old Army Ranger, but his body had gotten old. If any of them had a chance, Sarah needed to help. The tires screeched as Sarah brought her car to a stop. Sid ran over to the Taurus, thankful Marty had given him the keys to hold on to. He opened the trunk and soon had the bag he needed. Inside the bag was a thermos bottle holding the knockout gas, the gas mask, Marty's .22 pistol, and the .45 pistol the kitchen killer had. It took him a few minutes before he found the knife that Nellie had transferred during the car swap. Sarah stood beside him as he retrieved the weapons. He handed her the .22. You take your car and go up the front way. At the halfway point in the driveway, stop. Stop the car. I suspect that they'll have to take a look out and just watch you waiting. Let them come get you. You have to know how many of them there are. Hide the gun. Sid had just located the knife. And hide this, he said while handing her the knife. And this thermos is knockout gas. The guy at Neil's condo used on us. I don't have a clue as to what it is or how potent it might be or how much is left. I'll get into the basement and hopefully be able to hear you. You need to get as many of them as you can into one room and Marty and Nellie in another room. Somehow let Marty know we're attacking with gas. After thinking for a moment, Sid continued, Remember that telepathic trick we used to play? Yes. Man, woman, child, beast, fowl, insect, Sarah recited. Right. 1, 2, 3. I doubt there's more than that of them. Start with 9/11, Sarah offered. Okay. Kitchen, den, master, small, living room. Repeat. Kitchen, den, master, small, living room. She added, Give me enough time to get into the cellar. They'd been walking toward Sarah's car. The embrace was natural and easy, like they'd never stopped doing it. Twilight zone, he said. Love you, she said. More, he countered. 15 minutes later, Sid was in the dark cellar and out of breath. When they had the cabin built, they built the cellar mostly for warmth. The wood-chip stove would heat the low-ceiling cellar, and vents to each room above would benefit from the heat. The ceiling was inches over Sid's head. He could hear the television on in the living room, and for a few minutes there were no voices to be heard. Sid looked at his watch and figured Sarah must be stopped in the driveway. Sid heard a low voice and knew it was someone talking over a radio. A louder voice responded. Still just sitting there? And you don't see anyone leave the car? Go get her, and be careful. Sid had gradually started breathing normally. He could not believe the run up the hill had taken so much out of him. Need to start going to the gym, he thought, knowing it would never happen. The very thought made him audibly whisper, Yuck! It was pitch black in most of the cellar. The kitchen, living room, and den vents let in some light. The lights in the bedroom were off. Sid carefully made his way around the cellar, making sure that there was nothing in his way of getting to whatever vent he needed to access. He moved a few things and was comforted by the fact that his eyes had adjusted to the very low light. He could see well enough to quickly navigate the small enclosure. Sid positioned himself under the kitchen vent that was letting in most of the light. From out of the small bag he took out the gas mask and the thermos. He quickly adjusted the gas mask and put it on. He had to adjust some more to make sure that the seal was tight. He carefully opened the thermos. Sid wanted to make sure that there was no leaking of the gas when he opened the thermos. No point knocking myself out. But how am I going to know it's not leaking? He thought while imagining a colorless, odorless gas. With the thermos open, Sid broke the seal of the mask and took a tiny breath. He waited for any change in his thinking or any indication of smell, and when nothing happened, he took out the canister from the thermos and inspected it. There was a flow knob with a rubber tube attached. Just turn the knob. Simple enough, he thought, and he took off the mask. He shook the canister, hoping there might be liquid he could feel shake to get a feeling for how much gas he could get out of it. It shook as if it was empty. Crap! This is really shooting in the dark. Sid began reassessing his options. There was only one way up into the house from the cellar. There was a trap door in the kitchen pantry coming to the cellar stairs. Maybe he should just forget the gas and get into the pantry where he could rush the man from above him. Sid quietly crept up the stair steps and tested the trap door, and it moved. So glad nothing's on it, he thought, and was grateful Sarah and not himself had been living in and cleaning the cabin. He normally had the dog food in the bag sitting on the trap door. He was still contemplating the charging while brandishing the .45 pistol when he heard Sarah's voice and Nellie's response. Shit, he thought. Let's hope there's a gas. Sid also heard a second unfamiliar male voice. Now there were at least two of them. But had the second one been in the house, or was he on the outside? Sid decided he had to wait for Sarah to let him know. They were all in the living room. Sid heard Marty's voice as he and Sarah were introduced by Nellie. The first bad guy interrupted the greetings by saying, Nice little family. Where's your husband? Sarah corrected him. My ex-husband, and I don't know where the bastard is. Even knowing it was for show, Sid found himself hurt by Sarah's words. Sarah continued, What's this all about? It's 9/11. Nell? Sid heard the 9/11 code, and the use of Nellie's name right after it indicated woman or child. They had still been teenagers when they first discovered the game. 36 playing cards were laid face down. Sarah would pretend to be telepathic and able to know which card an unsuspecting friend would choose. While Sarah would not see the choice, Sid would. Then he would indicate the position of the card by code. The position was in 2 coordinates, determined by 6 across and 6 down. The first card had the code man, the second woman, the third child, the fourth beast, and the fifth fowl, and the last insect. The code would be passed in what seemed to be normal conversation, while Sarah divined the chosen card. Thus a statement from Sid like, John's son, man and child, would mean the card was over 1 and down 3. Over the years, Sid and Sarah had simplified the code to make it their secret way of passing information. Sarah had given him a code to indicate how many men were there, but the use of Nellie was confusing. Upstairs, Sarah realized she had given a confusing code. She turned to the stranger who soon seemed to be in charge, demanding, My daughter should not be held hostage. Sid thought, Of course she would think of Nellie as her child. A mother always thinks that way, no matter how old the child is. There was a total of 3 bad guys. 2 must be inside and a third outside. Upstairs, Sarah was being obnoxious. Sid started laughing in spite of the dangerous situation that they were in. The more he tried to stop laughing, the more over the top Sarah seemed to go. She sounded like a frantic, off-the-wall lunatic. She was screaming at the bad guy, who kept trying to get her to quiet down. Sid realized that Sarah had made her way over to Marty. Sarah was still babbling, but seemed to be hugging Marty. Sid knew she was letting him know that they were going to try using the knockout gas. Upstairs, everyone was standing. Marty would have backed away from the crazy lady that was in his face and wanting to give him a hug, if he had not seen Nellie mouth the word fake. He hoped she meant her mother was faking this nutty routine. He gave Sarah a hug back while she whispered, "Knockout gas." Marty realized Sid must be somewhere close by, prepared to unleash the gas from a canister used by the man he had killed. Long shot, Marty thought. But he also realized he had to separate himself and Nellie from wherever Sarah would try to corral the 2 bad guys. Sarah had planned the routine as she drove to the cabin and sat in the car waiting. She imagined Sid making his way up the hill to the small outside door that would give him access to the cellar. She realized the best place to stage the attack would be in the kitchen. If the gas did not work, the .22 pistol would not stop the 2 intruders, although it would slow him down. Sid might be able to surprise them by unexpectedly coming from the pantry. His .45 pistol would make more of an impression. Sarah was no longer hugging Marty, but she was holding him close by securing each of his arms in her hands. Very loudly she said to him, "It just seems so weird that all this has to do with 9/11, Marty." Sarah pulled Marty to her again in a giant hug. Sid heard the code "man." It would be the kitchen. He secured the .45 under his belt. He got beneath the vent, put on the gas mask, and prepared to release the gas. The canister was in his left hand, and he was able to hold it up to the vent, close enough to push the rubber tube up into the almost closed vent. Luckily it stayed there, freeing his right hand, which could now control the flow knob of the canister. While Sid prepared, Sarah was still holding Marty. Her purse was now between herself and Marty, and her back was to the 2 bad guys. She had practiced the move of quickly removing the .22 from the purse hanging from her neck while she had waited in the car. As she separated from Marty, Sarah reached in and grabbed the pistol. As soon as it was in her hand, she turned it on the bad guys. Now she was really screaming, and had both the pistol and the knife in each hand and waving them at the bad guys. Nellie was stunned by the profanity coming from her mother. Marty grabbed Nellie and began backing them both away from Sarah. He was prepared to go anywhere Sarah was not going. Roger Gardner cursed, although no one really heard him. He was not prepared to deal with a lunatic. His orders had been to contain the targets and wait for further instructions. His boss was out getting gas. So much for instructions. The .22 was not a real threat, but the crazy lady or someone else might get hurt if he tried to disarm her. She was screaming at him and Eddie to get into the kitchen. Roger's mind was working at full speed, trying to figure a safe way to take the pistol and knife away from the lunatic. Roger nodded to Eddie to do as she said. They were both backing up into the small kitchen. Roger was talking, trying to get her to reason. "Lady, we're the good guys. I'm not here to hurt you. We just need to talk to your husband, ex-husband." "Lying bastard." kept getting repeated over and over by Sarah, as she kept waving the gun, indicating they should get into the kitchen. Eddie was already backing up into the kitchen with Roger right behind him. Roger realized the screaming would alert Steve outside. He imagined Steve rushing through the door with his gun drawn and did not want to think beyond that. He had to get the situation under control before Steve got into the mix. With the gun pointed in his direction, the danger from Sarah was directed at him. If she discharged the .22 when he disarmed her, the other two in the room were probably out of any danger. He decided to wait until he and Sarah were both beyond the kitchen threshold. Marty also realized the danger from the men outside. He had looked around for some sort of weapon. He could see through the window toward the porch, lit by the outside light. The lookout was already running toward the porch stairs. Sid was hearing everything. He started turning the flow knob, forcing himself to wait for the canister to hopefully discharge the gas. His instinct was to drop the canister and rush up the stairs, but he was hearing the faintest of hisses. Sarah was right at the kitchen threshold. Roger simply reached out with an unbelievably fast motion and grabbed Sarah's gun-toting hand, securing the gun. At the same time, he grabbed her other arm, preventing her from doing anything with the knife. Roger heard a thump behind him. He saw the front door open, and Steve standing there with gun drawn. But by then the whole house seemed to be spinning. He did not feel anything when he hit the floor. Marty's only available weapon was the lamp on the table next to the door, and before Steve opened the door, Marty had let go of Nellie and rushed toward the light. As the door was opening, Marty picked up the light, pulling the wire out of the socket, and was swinging it. Steve never saw it coming. He was hit so hard he stumbled backward, falling down the porch steps. Marty rushed him and kicked the gun out of his hand, but he kicked it so hard he had no idea where it had gone in the dark. Marty did not like to fist fight. He was just awful at it. Sid heard the first and then the second thud. He took it to mean two of the bad guys were knocked out. As he dropped the canister to make a run up the stairs, he heard a third thud. "Sarah," he mumbled. Moments later, he was through the trap door and out into the pantry. Two men were lying on the kitchen floor, and Sarah was lying on the floor at the threshold. Nellie did not know what was happening. She did not know about the knockout gas. At the same moment, Marty was rushing away from her and grabbing the light. Nellie saw the intruder disarm her mother. A moment later, the front door was crashed open and Marty was hitting the lookout with the light. When Nellie looked back toward her mom, she saw Sarah crashing to the floor. Nellie rushed to her mother. Just as she got there, she was startled by a man rushing toward her with a gas mask on. Her father's muffled voice yelled, "Run!" Nellie turned and had taken a step before the gas overtook her. As Nellie was wobbling and passing out, Sid got to her. He grabbed her enough to break her fall. He picked her up and rushed her out the front door. Sid realized he had not turned off the flow valve, and it could still be pushing gas into the cellar, where it would be escaping through the vents into the entire house. Sid was not expecting the sight he encountered beyond the door. Marty was sitting in one of the wooden Adirondack porch chairs. Underneath the chair, and secured by the lower stabilizer, was a man who seemed to be having a problem breathing. Sid put Nellie down beside Marty and handed him the .45, before turning and running back into the house. Moments later, he returned with Sarah, who looked lifeless. Sid checked for a pulse. It seemed an eternity before he felt it. It seemed strong enough. While the chair was still on top of Steve, Marty was no longer sitting in it. He was with Nellie, who was already becoming responsive. "You feel okay?" came Sid's muffled voice from beneath the gas mask. "Yes," Marty replied. "Still move them farther from the house." Sid ran back into the house. How much gas was in that container? Marty wondered and then thought, how far from the house? He decided to use Steve as a warming meter. The man was lying at the bottom of the steps. If he suddenly passed out, Marty would know the gas was seeping out of the house. As he had to keep the 45 trained on Steve, Marty only had one hand to use to move the women. He pulled Sarah across the grass until he thought they were out of range. By the time he started pulling Nellie, she was wide awake. Enough to complain, "What the hell are you doing?" Marty was never so happy to be yelled at. Sid did not want anyone to die. He was already on the brink of total exhaustion and did not think he could get the man out of the kitchen as dead weight. He opened the kitchen window and ran around, turning on all the ceiling fans in the house. Each room had one. He threw whatever he could find over the vents, and then he started opening every window. Suddenly, Sid realized that the men would be reviving. He ran back to the kitchen. No, they were still out. He looked them over until he had secured each of their guns, and he checked for pulses and found them. Then he retrieved some duct tape and wrapped it around each man's wrists. Sid thought, I wonder if this is on the list of uses for duct tape. By the time Sid ran back outside, the only thing that he could do was slump to the ground next to Sarah. Nellie was sitting up, and Marty was calling to Sarah as he gently shook her. Sid took off the gas mask and said, "Sarah, come on, baby, wake up." He looked over from Marty and began to sit Sarah up and cradle her in his arms while continuing to talk to her. None of them noticed Jimmy and Bob Stevens walk up, to within 6 feet of him. Bob was holding a submachine gun. Bob's voice startled them as he said gruffly, "No one move." In spite of the warning, both Marty and Sid turned. Marty still had the 45 in his hands. Jimmy, fearful Bob was about to shoot Marty, yelled, "Friends!" Sid, realizing he was looking at Jimmy, also yelled, "Marty, put it down." Marty had forgotten all about the 45. He realized what was happening and slowly moved his gun hand down and continued to put it on the ground while he held up his other hand. Marty did not need an introduction to the man who just had to be Jimmy Morris. As soon as he realized Marty was putting down the gun, Sid turned to his brother. He had momentarily forgotten Jimmy was supposed to be dead. "Guess I should be surprised to see you." Jimmy replied, "Sorry about that." Sarah was stirring in Sid's arms. Jimmy asked, "She all right? What happened here?" Sid answered, "Knockout gas. 2 others are in the kitchen. Your guys?" Jimmy noticed the gas mask next to Sid. Standard issue. His own people had probably supplied the gas back in New York. "Sid, you're going to have to give me the details. I'm impressed." "You know the gas? Are you guys going to be okay? Always looking out for the other guy, aren't you?" "It is who I am." "How much did they get?" "Maybe a lot." "Bob, go check on 'em. Through the door to the left, back. Take the mask." Sid picked up the mask and handed it to Bob, who was no longer holding the submachine gun on him. Jimmy took the weapon from Bob. Sarah's mouth just managed a quiet, "Jimmy?" "Good to see you, Sarah. Luckily, the gas didn't have any residual effects. You should be feeling fine in a few minutes." Jimmy looked over at Nellie and saw tears streaming down her face. "Sorry, Nell. We thought you were dead," Nellie replied. "Long story." Nellie got to her feet with Marty's assistance and slowly walked over to her uncle. As they embraced, a torrent of tears and emotions flowed from her. While holding the weapon in one hand, Jimmy held her tight with the other. "I've missed you guys," he said. Steve had pushed the chair off himself and was sitting up. Blood was running down his face. Jimmy asked, "You okay, Steve?" "Think so, sir." Steve had never heard James Morris ask anyone how they were doing. Steve kept looking from one twin to the other. Nothing felt right. He got to his feet. Jimmy handed him the submachine gun, and Steve immediately trained it on the others. "Damn, Steve," Jimmy ordered. "Put it down. I just don't like holding those things. Go take a walk through the house and see if you pass out. Help Bob." Then silently watched as Steve walked up the stairs, across the narrow porch and through the door. They did not hear any thumping or crashing. The gas was already gone. Jimmy said, "I hate to be rude, but I'm starved. You guys got anything in that house to eat?" Sarah was feeling fine in Sid's arms. "Tuna fish," she offered. "Sounds great," Jimmy responded. "As I remember, you make an awesome tuna fish." Day 3. Roger, Eddie, and Steve had left in the black SUV. Sarah had made tuna fish sandwiches that were quickly devoured. Sid was not surprised Sarah could so easily feed 6 people. Sarah was always prepared to be the perfect hostess. There was always frozen bread and cans of tuna fish waiting. Sarah's mom had been the inspiration. Sarah was the youngest of 5, and her 4 siblings were brothers, who were never far from hunger. Sarah had used the kitchen phone to call Crystal, to let her know that everything was fine. Jimmy was sitting at the dining room table, close enough to overhear the conversation. He could not hear Crystal say, "Sarah, I know you're saying everything's fine, but I'm getting vibes that things are not so okay. I want to throw the cards. You okay with that?" Crystal wanted to ask the tarot cards for clarification, but before she could do that, she needed Sarah's okay. Sarah had long given up on any doubts regarding Crystal and her card reading. Over the decade of their friendship, Sarah had never seen Crystal and the cards wrong. Often the readings were vague or inclusive, but even more often insight afforded from the unorthodox source was detained and accurate. Sarah answered, "That would be fine." Crystal replied, "Jimmy's listening, isn't he?" "Right. And you're not sure about him either. You have your doubts. The kids and Sid might want to get their stuff from their rooms if they're going to stay up there. Or do you think they'll be coming back here tonight?" "You know, I think they should come back here tonight so I can tell Nellie what the cards say. Then she can get back with you and let you know what they say. Get them here and you stay balanced, okay? Have them picking up Duke." Sarah loved the way Crystal would think out loud. "I'll go get him. And I need to pick up some stuff for breakfast. I'll find out what the others intend. Are you home or at the motel?" "Great. I'll get the cards warmed up. I'm at home, but I'll take the dogs and meet you there." "See you soon. Love you much," Sarah said before hanging up. Sarah returned to the group sitting around the dining room and said, "I have to go pick up Duke from Crystal's. Are you all going back there to sleep, or are any of you wanting to stay here tonight?" Nellie asked, "Mom, does Dad know about Meg?" She looked at her dad. Sid just shook his head yes. Jimmy ignored the sadness that had filled the room and said, "Well, why don't you decide where you're going to sleep later? I really need to hear the stories, and we have a whole night ahead of us. Let's just party." Jimmy got up and reached for his wallet. While taking out some bills, he said, "Sarah, get us some beer, snacks, you know the stuff, and ask Crystal to come with you. I'd love to see her again." 15 minutes later, Sarah was greeted by the dogs, who were more subdued than earlier. They were confused by the late-night trip back to the motel. Crystal was sitting at her table with the tarot cards ready to be read. As she sat down opposite Crystal, Sarah said, "Jimmy wants you to come home with me. He'd love to see you again. Now that makes me very suspicious. You know the guy hates me. Maybe he hates what you believe in, but I don't think he hates you. Yes, he does. He knows I know who he really is. And what's that? Evil. The man has an evil streak. His aura is just full of crap. I've never been able to understand how identical twins can look exactly alike and yet be opposite spirits. He seems different to me, Sarah noted. People don't change their basic nature, Crystal replied. Some of them do, Sarah countered. Some of them do. I hope you're right about Jimmy. Let's ask the cards. 10 minutes later, the cards had revealed their message. Told you, Crystal said. Sarah was upset by the message. Deceit and major danger summarized the reading. What are you going to do? Crystal asked. Don't know. Guess I'll just play it by ear. You coming back with me? Wouldn't miss it. If the cards are right, you could be putting yourself in danger too. I'll have Randy with me. The women laughed. Randy was definitely not a dog that you could count on for protection. They got up the table and Crystal took the set of keys to open the convenience store. They picked up a supply of snacks and food for breakfast. Crystal and Randy went in Sarah's car, and they knew someone would be going back to the motel and Crystal could get a return ride. They had driven all the way up the narrow road when that became the driveway. Crystal asked, Where's Jimmy's car? Sarah felt stupid. She had not even noticed on the way down there that there was no other car. How did Jimmy and his friends get here? She thought, before answering Crystal's question with, I don't know. They took the dogs over to the pen and put them up. As they walked toward the house, they could hear laughter. Obviously, someone was telling a good story. Sarah entered first, and the laughter stopped. Sarah asked, Jimmy, where's your car? Didn't come by car. He got up and started toward the door where Crystal just entered the cabin. Crystal? Wow, you haven't changed a bit. You look great. You look pretty good for a dead man, she replied. Long story, Jimmy said while giving Crystal a hug. Crystal kept herself contained and ended the hug as soon as she could. Jimmy had his arm around her and said to everyone, Follow me. Crystal managed to distance herself from Jimmy, who continued walking toward the clearing on the east part of the property. The others were dutifully following. They were virtually on top of the helicopter before any of them noticed it. In the darkness, That's my ride, Jimmy said. Marty went up to it saying, Oh, wow, what a beauty. He looked over to Jimmy, silently asking if he could open the door. Sure. Let me show you this thing, Jimmy said while opening the door. No light automatically came on. Jimmy had to push the switch to reveal the amazing interior. There were 2 leather seats up front and another full leather seat in the back, which could handle 3 passengers without any lack of comfort. Beautiful, Marty noted. Meanwhile, he was diligently studying everything he could see. Whatever this was, it was definitely state-of-the-art. Is it weaponized? He asked. Jimmy laughed while ignoring the question. Come on, guys, take a look. Jimmy stepped back and let the others view his ride. After everyone had taken a good look, they started to head back to the cabin. Jimmy said, Bob, maybe you should stay here. I doubt anyone will be coming out here and stumble on the chopper, but maybe you should just stay here with it. Yes, sir. On the way back, Sid sauntered up to Jimmy and asked, Who the hell are you? Of that I'm not sure, Jimmy replied. While Sarah had met with Crystal and the cards, the others had been telling Jimmy about the kitchen killing, the attack by Sid and his gas, and the gun and knife toting Sarah. Sid, Nellie, and Marty did not mention any of the far-flung conversations of conspiracy that had filled their 9-hour trip from New York. When they got settled back into the cabin with beer in their hands, it was Jimmy's turn to talk. Marty was the one who pressed Jimmy. "Why did you fake a suicide?" "We thought destruction of the second tower would need a fall guy. We thought it would all be blamed on an accident, and I would be the focus of any investigation. I was the one at the controls when a perfectly sound tower crashed, and I just know too much to be questioned." Nellie asked, "Who do you work for?" "An ultra-secret organization dedicated to protecting America and everything it represents." It was Sarah's turn. "The secret government? The ones who are really the power behind the facade of what we think is our government? The ones who really flew those planes into the towers in the Pentagon? The ones who blamed Arab terrorists to put America in a state of fear so intense that we would just sit by and let a fascist-minded group rip all of our rights away in the name of security?" Sarah had worked herself up, and her anger permeated the room. Jimmy took an audible breath before replying, "No, Sarah. I'm one of the guys fighting the fascist. I'm the guy fighting the remnants of Nazi Germany." Jimmy's words stunned his listeners. There were moments of silence before Jimmy continued. After World War II ended, after 2,000 Nazi office officials, and particularly those in the SS, disappeared, with them they took an undeterminable but huge amount of treasure. In the decades since, they've been operating across the world. They have permeated whole nations, but mostly they have acquired vast economic power. They work behind the scenes and are very difficult to ferret out. Jimmy went silent, letting his words sink in. Sid asked, "So, are you saying some Nazi organization is out running major corporations and nations, and they found it necessary to kill 3,000 Americans? Why?" "For the very reasons Sarah just stated. They want America very much afraid. The only way to control a population is to keep it in a state of fear. And it's even easier to control government officials paralyzed by fear. All those who questioned the conclusions about 9/11 made by government officials were right. There was an orchestrated cover-up of what actually happened. If the American public understood the full story, fear would be beyond anything that they could imagine." Jimmy looked over to where Sarah and Crystal were sitting. "You two know what I'm talking about?" Sarah asked. "How do you know what we might know?" "The chopper is a stealth vehicle. I was hovering over Crystal's house as you told Sid about the directed energy weapon. I was immensely impressed. You discovered what it took U.S. government agencies months to piece together." Marty was sitting in rapt attention. He asked, "What the hell are you people talking about?" "You tell him, Sarah," Jimmy directed. "I'm not sure I know anything more than you do." Sarah did not believe that statement at all. By now she was certain she was dealing with someone whom she would normally consider the enemy. Anyone knowing what Jimmy knew would have to be dirty in some way. Secret organizations are by nature spawning grounds for people who need to keep secrets. Sarah believed anyone who needs to keep secrets of those kinds are tainted. Well, Jim, I really would love to hear what you think. Jimmy had underestimated Sarah. Everyone was just looking at him. Mind if I get another beer and some chips? It was like a time out. Everyone replenished their drinks, and the snacks were opened and put out. Some even took bathroom breaks. Jimmy was silently assessing his options. One way or another, he had nothing to lose in telling the truth. Either way, they would all come aboard or they would all have to die. Pilot Bob Stevens was sitting in the back seat of the helicopter. He'd made himself comfortable and was dozing off when he felt his cell phone vibrating. "Yeah," he said after answering. Roger replied, "Hey, what's going on?" "I'm in a chopper waiting on the boss." "What's he thinking?" "Don't have a clue." Did he really mean for us to leave, or was he putting on a show? I mean, this is not SOP. "Where are you?" "Just down the street." "I don't think he'll need you." "You're loaded?" "Yes." "With what?" "Incendiary." "Damn," Roger said. The helicopter was armed with an incendiary missile. If they were to use it on the cabin, everyone inside would die, and it would look like a tragic house fire. Roger commented, "I wouldn't want to be in his shoes." "What would you do?" Bob was slow to reply. "To have to decide whether or not my identical twin brother and his family were collateral damage?" "Yeah. I don't think I could make that decision." "Me neither." "Okay. We'll just stay here until you tell me otherwise. Maybe he'll come up with another alternative." Back in the cabin, Jimmy was scheming. There was no way to tell a big lie, which was the way to handle most people. But Jimmy was confronting an audience with superior intelligence and knowledge. When you cannot tell a big lie, Jimmy was taught, to stay close to the truth and avoid giving away any really critical information. The group had reassembled in the living room. "Okay, then," Jimmy began. He looked at Sid and said, "I never lied to you. The demolition system had been planned for after the '93 bombing at the towers. But you know how slow the government acts. My group got involved for reasons other than protecting the surrounding buildings. To be honest, that's not our normal modus operandi. But the proposed demolition system offered us an opportunity we could not walk away from. The demolition system was extremely complex and required intense computer control, simply because of the very scale of what they wanted done. A rather massive computer control center would be required, and that was what we were after. The only place to put such a control center was in Building 7. That building had tenants which we wanted to watch. Sarah interrupted, "Don't you mean spy on?" Jimmy confirmed, "Okay, spied on. The Department of Defense, the IRS, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the U.S. Secret Service, and particularly the CIA, were all there. It was like having all the eggs in one basket. By building the Demolition System Control Center in the same building, we could have unprecedented access to some of our most important targets." Sid was incredulous. He asked, "The only reason you built the demolition system was to have a command center in the building?" "Right." Nellie asked, "How did you manage to get chosen for the operation to begin with?" Jimmy smiled. "We do pretty much anything we need to do. The New York Port Authority thought that we were hiring a company that had worked for the government on secret projects and were in the gray area between legitimate and black ops. Actually, all that's true." Marty asked, So what you're saying is, your really only real concern was spying on U.S. agencies? Right. Marty continued his questioning. And you and your group had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual attacks on the towers? Jimmy did not flinch in lying absolutely correct. You had no idea hijacked airliners were going to be crashed into the Twin Towers? Again, Jimmy lied. Had no idea. Do you believe they were flown by Arab hijackers? Jimmy did not think he could get away with another big lie to Marty, so Jimmy decided to tell a smaller lie. I don't believe anybody aboard the aircraft were actually flying the planes. I think some kind of radio control was involved. Jimmy knew from Martin's website that radio control of the planes was already suspected. He did not want to indicate any knowledge of the electronic hijacking being connected to the satellites and changed to the flight data systems. And were you actually responsible for the towers being destroyed? No. We were prepared to execute the demolition system on the South Tower because the top of the building was going to slide off. But before we could do that, we lost all of our computer links. Nellie asked, and how did that happen? That's the trillion-dollar question now. That's what we've been trying to determine for the last year. We simply lost all sensor data and all control. The computers just froze. Sarah picked up the questioning. Well, what the hell engaged the demolition sequence? Did it just engage all by itself? Or had someone else essentially hijacked your demolition system? Jimmy paused before answering Sarah's questions. Talking about that half hour of time between the collapse of the South Tower and the North Tower's destruction still filled him with confusion and fear. Our demolition system did go off, but we're not even sure if the bad guys planned for that. The bad guys used a destructive force that no one had ever seen before. Oh, theoretically. Such a weapon had been talked about, but no one had the ability to even consider actually making one. It was like someone suddenly had an energy ray you could see only in a Star Wars movie. Marty asked, what kind of energy ray are you talking about? You talking electromagnetic, like in a taser, or in a microwave amplification, or something like a particle beam? With all due respect, Marty, nothing you know about was used. Whatever they did went beyond anything anyone has ever contemplated. It's way beyond my understanding, and it honestly doesn't matter. Whatever it is, we have no way of defending ourselves against it. The only analogy that I can give is that we are like Japan when the atom bomb destroyed 2 of their cities. The Japanese had no way to defend themselves, and they just unconditionally surrendered. The Japanese knew who their enemies were and who to surrender to. We don't know who attacked us, how to defend ourselves against this incredible weapon, or whom to surrender to. Sid observed, but didn't you early pin it on a remnant group of Nazis? Yes, they are the prime suspect. And even back in Germany during the 1930s, the Nazis were attempting to create a variety of different weapons based upon various forms of energy. In my mind, it's conceivable and probable that they could have finally found the ultimate energy weapon. But even then, we can identify who comprises this secret Nazi organization. We know some things, but not enough. And that was why we were intent upon getting into Building 7. We need to know how far Nazi infiltration has spread within our government and businesses. Sid, looking at Sarah, said, "Sarah, are you going to buy into this Nazi bullshit?" Sarah looked around at the others before replying, "Well, I hate to break this to you, but yes." There were 2,000 or more Nazis who disappeared, and there's substantial information indicating that they had a massive facility in the Antarctic. The primary source for this information revolves around a U.S. naval operation called Operation High Jump, led by Admiral Byrd in the 1946 to 47 time frame. The purpose of the expedition was to destroy the Nazi facility. It appears that they failed in their mission. Sid threw up his hands while looking around. "Nellie, Marty, do you know about this?" Both Nellie and Marty shook their heads affirmatively. Sid looked at Crystal, asking, "Crystal, don't tell me you also know about this?" Crystal did not say anything. She just shook her head yes and pointed at Sarah. Sid got up. "Anyone else want a beer?" Crystal whispered to the group, "Do you think we should tell him about the alien flying saucers?" They all started to stifle their laugh while Sarah said, "Damn, don't go there." Sid returned holding his beer. "Jimmy, you just keep talking. Forget I ever ask you a question. I'll just assume that there are Nazis still trying to take over the world." The group laughed. Jimmy eventually said, "Where the hell was I?" Sid replied, "Death ray." "Oh, right. Well, a death ray, or a directed energy weapon, was what really pulverized the towers. What Sarah told you earlier was absolutely true." Nellie asked, "Mom, you knew about this?" Sarah said, "Yes. I discovered some abnormalities, and Tom McNally and I worked at trying to determine what could have caused them. Apparently your uncle overheard me telling your dad from his helicopter." It's much more succinct telling. Sarah discussed the melted cars, the rust, the filing cabinet, the dirt being poured over the site to stop the continuing molecular dissociation, and John Hutchison. Marty was the one who kept asking pertinent questions. Sarah concluded, "One deputy inspector for the New York Police Department is on film, saying he had not seen a computer, a phone, a door, or even a doorknob. And of course door handles were missing from cars. So something attacked metals and completely destroyed some type of metals. Another film shows bunches of plastic identification cards, where they say that for some reason plastic ID cards survived over all other things." Marty mumbled, "If it was pancaking floors, what happened to the doors and the rest of the metal stuff?" No one answered. Jimmy observed, "Sarah, I'm again overly impressed with your ability to research." Sarah replied calmly, "So what now, Jimmy? Is this a situation where, because you told us, you now have to kill us?" The blunt question stunned everyone, particularly Jimmy. He hesitated before saying, "In all honesty, that would be a standard operating procedure. But I really don't want to go there." The room was completely silent. It was more the way he said it than what he said. Everyone understood he meant it. Jimmy turned to Sid and said, "I don't know about the order for your execution. My suicide was supposed to dead-end any investigation regarding destruction of the North Tower. You were to be kept alive in case they needed someone with credibility to explain why the demolition system was put into place. It would be presented as a horrific accident. Our main goal was to keep the public from knowing about the directed energy weapon. We were afraid of what would happen if the public knew that their government, and in fact any government, was powerless against a secret enemy with a massive weapon. What was not expected was the public's and the media's reaction to the idea that planes alone could be blamed for destroying both towers. No one anticipated this fabrication would be believed, and when FEMA put out a preliminary report last May that fires weakened floor joists resulted in pancake collapse, no one really objected. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is now in the process of finalizing its report, which just details that basic premise of the plane crashes and ensuing fires being to blame. Not only are the public and media buying into this story, they're not looking at demolition as a possibility, and certainly not looking for the death rate being the cause. Well, at this point, Sid, not only were you not needed to explain the reason for putting in the demolition system, I didn't have to die, and somebody thought you did. And that's what started this whole scenario. I suspect the order for your death came from a guy named Carlin, who used to be my boss. Unfortunately, he died in a skiing accident in South America in July. While I took over his position, I didn't know anything about the order for your killing. Jimmy looked at Marty. Thank you, Marty. It may not have been Sid's time to die, but he certainly would have without your intervention. Jimmy turned back to Sid and said, You are a loose end. There are other more powerful people who may decide that Carlin was right, and you just can't assume safety. The only way that I can keep you safe is to take you with me. Plus, this really is war. Someone declared war on America on 9/11. I really need you to help me figure this out. And you do love being a patriot. Jimmy turned to Sarah before continuing. And I need you to help me, Sarah. You've been way more right than I ever gave you credit for. Sid will only be safe with me, and I need both of you looking at the data that may lead us to know our enemy. I'm asking you both to just come with me for the short term. There are very few people that I can trust. Crystal, I need you to be silent. Nothing you know should ever be passed on. Somehow Sarah has to convince that McNally guy to just keep quiet. If any of you start talking, your lives won't be worth shit. Sooner or later, it's all going to hit the fan. But right now, you have to let it just sit. Just go on about your life and be content knowing you know more than most. Marty, I've read your website, and I'm pretty sure you have an organization behind you. There's no way you should have been able to swap Sid's Jeep for whatever you ended up driving. By the way, whoever was in that Jeep disappeared at the Pittsburgh airport. Well done. Marty smiled, relieved Tim and Anita were safe. But, Jimmy continued, you were no longer listed as a moderate threat. I'll try to purge the record of all this, but I may not be able to do that. You have to assume that you're now on a high threat end of things. Nobody's going to be watching you. But if you come to their attention, things could get nasty. Same goes for you now. Perhaps I should just take you with me, too. But without your father, you wouldn't be considered a threat. All in all, you're probably safer if you just go back to business as usual. I'm going out to the chopper and wait your decisions. Talk it over. I'll be back in, 20 minutes? Sound okay? Jimmy asked while looking at each other. Okay then, I'll be back in 20 minutes. They watched him walk out of the door. Everyone just sat silent and immersed in their own thoughts. Finally, Sid said, "Guess I should have brought my toothbrush." Sarah said, "I have a new one for you. Suppose you don't have to worry about clothes. Looks like you and Jim still about the same size." "Guys," Marty was whispering, "he said he'd heard what you were saying inside Crystal's house. Anything we say may be monitored. And I've got to tell you, I just don't trust the dude." Nellie whispered back, "Why?" "I think he's lying about the plane attack. I think his group was involved in that part of it." Nellie again whispered, "Why do you think that?" "My gut is telling me that he lied about that. Sid, why would Jimmy have told you about the FedEx plane's pilotless landings? Why would he bring that up if it wasn't on his mind last year?" Before Sid could answer, Nellie asked, "What FedEx plane?" Everyone started rearranging their seating to get closer, to be able to hear all of the whispering. Sid started answering in a normal voice and was hushed by Marty. "Sorry," Sid whispered. "In my last conversation with Jimmy before 9/11, he told me about a FedEx plane being controlled by radio that was successfully landed. No pilot. This happened in August, but Marty says the event was not announced until way after 9/11. We don't know how Jimmy knew and why he thought it was important to mention it to me." "Right," Marty whispered. "I just think it's suspicious." Sid whispered back, "Marty, I've given this some thought. Jimmy was really melancholy in that phone call, and we did spend the best time flying the RC planes. It may just be coincidence that he mentioned it when he did. The fact is, who he is likely the reason he knew about it before its official announcement. I don't see that there's enough evidence to say he's lying." Marty sat silently contemplating Sid's remark. Sarah looked at Crystal, who was huddled up right next to her, and asked, "What do you think?" Crystal whispered, "I think he's changed. I don't think he's telling the whole story, but I think he's overall being truthful." Sarah looked at Crystal with surprise. Crystal ignored Sarah and continued, "Sid, I never liked your brother. You were like the proverbial good twin, bad twin. Right now I'm seeing Jimmy having two sides. The bad side's been dominating his life. The good side's trying to take over. If you don't go with him, I fear the bad side will take over again." Marty added, "And if the bad side takes over, we're all dead. I'm telling you, that chopper is weaponized. I don't know if it's loaded with a missile or what, but that control panel had an advanced targeting display. I think Jimmy wanted me to see it as a sort of threat." Crystal had detected something out of the chopper, and she thought Marty might be right. Why else would Jimmy have taken them out to see it? Just to impress everyone? All he had to do was tell them it was there. Instead, he dragged them all out to actually see the damn thing. She whispered, "Why don't we just make a run out the back way?" Marty answered, "Because if I'm right, the three thugs didn't leave the vicinity. They should be outside surrounding the house and watching. If we try to run, they'll stop us, just one way or another." Nellie looked at Sarah and asked, "Mom, what are you going to do?" Sarah was slow to whisper back, "I'm going with your father. I thought I could live without him. I was okay while he was sitting here and doing nothing for all those years. I knew where he was and what he was doing. But this last year was hell. I didn't know where he was, nor if he was safe. I don't want to go through that again myself." She turned toward Sid. Okay? Sid smiled and whispered back, okay. He turned toward Nellie, asking, Nellie, you okay with this? No, not at all. I love the fact that you two are back together again. But am I going to see you again? What kind of danger are you getting into? Nellie suddenly turned toward Marty, who was sitting right beside her and very close. Marty, what do you think? I think they don't have much of a choice. Jimmy's not going to let your father just be, and your mom might get answers she's been searching for her whole life. And I do think we're at war. I'm just not sure who the enemy really is. Crystal again began to whisper. Do we have to keep whispering? They all looked at each other and silently agreed that whispering was over. Good, Crystal said out loud. What's going to happen to the cabin and Duke? Sarah and Sid just looked at each other. Going someplace was interesting, but Crystal's questions made them realize that they were going to have to leave their old lives behind. Nellie just commented, I'll take care of Duke, and he'll be happier here, and I'll spend time between New York and here. I'll just play it by ear, but don't worry about Duke. Between Crystal and me, Duke in the cabin will be safe. She looked at Crystal, asking, Right, Crystal? Only if you'll be my new best friend. Crystal reached out and grabbed Sarah and pulled her close. Crystal was crying, and Sarah joined her. That made the others also tear up. When Jimmy walked in a few minutes later, he was greeted by a room full of crying people. Sid saw him and got up, wiping his wet face with his hands. We're still going to be able to see each other, right? Sarah also got up and went for a box of tissues. Jimmy replied, I can't commit to that right now. I just don't know what's going to happen. Sarah asked, What about my job? I need to arrange taking leave. Jimmy said, That can be done. It's not like you're going to go to the ends of the earth. You're just going home with me. We'll try to make everything all right. Sarah said, I'll pack some things, and she left the room. Sid turned to Marty. What are your intentions? Marty was just damn confused. I'm not sure. Guess I'll go back to doing what I was doing. No, I mean in regards to my daughter. Both Marty and Nellie blushed. Dad, she said. Crystal laughed. The cards say that they'll make some babies. Nellie looked stunned and asked, You threw the tarot cards about me and Marty? I was bored and nervous, and I just wondered, and yeah, I did. Nellie stole a glance at Marty, who had one sheepish grin across his face that Nellie was finding handsome, handsomer than she'd noticed before. But, Crystal, Nellie asked, I thought you could only read the cards for someone with their permission. Crystal replied, Oops, and she laughed. Sid commented, I think they'll be very pretty babies. Sarah had come back into the room, and Sid yelled to her, Hey, Sarah, you're going to be a grandmother. Sarah, preoccupied with getting whatever she needed, stopped and exclaimed, What? And they all started laughing, including Jimmy. Crystal explained, It's in the cards. Well, let me see what we have here. There is reference information in the back of the book, and there's about 6 pages of references for each section of the book. Reference information says that the average citizen will not have known many of the facts presented in this book. Only those having the time and motivation to follow various threads of questions and challenges to the official explanation would be exposed to 9 years of debating the truth. The following are brief notes pointing to reference sources to aid anyone interested in determining the truth for themselves. It should be noted that information is disappearing from the Internet, and some of these references may not still be valid. While doing a web search of anything, you should question. While doing a web search of anything you question is recommended, be careful that the search does not bring up just one side of the debate. My website is 911crusade.com, but I'm not sure that that is still Nancy's website. Most of you know that it's cosmicreality.net. Sorry about that. So there is sources for the information she has presented here. And I hope you've enjoyed this book. And I am awaiting a sequel, because I want to know what the hell happened after that. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this book. And I hope you all enjoyed me reading this book. And for now, I thank you all for coming. See you all later.